I am Simone, 35 years old, and I have spent my entire life being the scapegoat of my family. My sister mocked me in front of the most elite family in the state, laughing that I was just a lowly court admin. Her billionaire future father-in-law scoffed, and her fiancé crossed his arms asking what I actually do for a living. I looked him dead in the eye and answered with one single word. The entire dining room went dead silent. My parents turned completely pale. And that was the exact moment they realized the mistake they had made. But it was already too late. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who constantly underestimated your worth. The evening air was crisp as I stepped out of my modest sedan and handed my keys to the valet at the Kensington Country Club. The sprawling estate was a monument to old money with towering oak trees, manicured hedges, and a grand stone facade that reeked of generational wealth. I was only here because my parents, Desmond and Valerie, had begged me to attend the engagement dinner for my younger sister Chloe and her fiancé Spencer Kensington. Spencer was the heir to a massive pharmaceutical empire, and my parents treated this union like a royal coronation. I smoothed down my dress. It was a custom-tailored silk sheath dress in deep emerald green. It cost more than my parents' mortgage payment, but to them I was just wearing another plain, boring outfit. In their eyes, I was the dark-skinned, natural-haired disappointment who refused to play the corporate game. Chloe, on the other hand, was the golden child. She was 32, light-skinned, with perfectly flat-ironed hair, and a career in public relations that mostly consisted of going to parties. I walked up the grand, sweeping staircase toward the main entrance, taking a deep breath to brace myself for the evening. Before I could even reach the brass doors, I heard her voice. "Simone, catch." I turned just in time to see a heavy set of keys flying toward my chest. I caught them out of pure reflex. They were the keys to a brand new Porsche. I looked up and saw Chloe standing near the entrance, flanked by Spencer and a few of his wealthy friends. She was wearing a heavily beaded designer gown that screamed for attention, a smug smile painted across her face. "Go park the car for Spencer, Simone," Chloe said loudly, her voice echoing across the stone portico. "The valet is taking too long, and we are already late for our own dinner. You are used to doing grunt work anyway. A little manual labor will not hurt you." Spencer and his friends chuckled. A few country club members passing by turned their heads to watch the spectacle. My parents, who had just stepped out of a black town car behind them, rushed up the steps. But instead of reprimanding Chloe for treating her older sister like a servant, my mother, Valerie, grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "Do not just stand there and embarrass us," Valerie hissed in my ear. "Just do what your sister asked. You are only an administrative assistant at the courthouse. It is not like you are above parking a car. We need the Kensingtons to see that we are cooperative." I looked at my mother, then at Chloe, and finally at the heavy Porsche keys in my hand. For 35 years, this was my reality. No matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, I was always reduced to the help. My family had absolutely no idea what I actually did at the courthouse. For the past 5 years, they never bothered to ask about my career beyond assuming I filed paperwork and answered phones. They did not know about the late nights studying case law, the grueling hours clerking for the Supreme Court, or the relentless dedication that had just culminated in the United States Senate confirming my appointment. They did not know that I was the youngest African American woman to be appointed as a federal district judge in our circuit. To them, I was just Simone, the spinster admin, who could not land a rich husband. I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply walked over to the valet podium, placed the Porsche keys on the counter, and turned back to face my sister. "I am a guest tonight, Chloe," I said, my voice steady and calm. "If Spencer wants his car parked, he can wait for the valet just like everyone else. I am not your employee." Chloe rolled her eyes dramatically, sighing, as if I had just ruined her entire night. "God, Simone, why do you always have to be so difficult? This is exactly why you are still single and stuck in a dead-end government job." You have absolutely no concept of networking or being useful to important people. Spencer stepped forward, wrapping a protective arm around Chloe's waist. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure pity. "It is fine, babe," Spencer said smoothly. "Do not be too hard on her. It is tough living paycheck to paycheck on a clerk's salary. Here, let me help out." Spencer reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and held it out to me. "Take it, Simone," he said with a condescending smirk. "Go buy yourself something nice. Or put it toward your rent. Consider it a tip for showing up." "My father." Desmond stepped forward, nodding eagerly. "Take the money, Simone. Say thank you to Spencer. He is being very generous to you." The sheer audacity of the moment hung in the air. A wealthy white heir handing $100 bill to a federal judge as a tip for existing, while her own black parents applauded the charity. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I maintained my composure. I reached out, took the $100 bill from Spencer's hand, and neatly folded it into my designer clutch. "Thank you, Spencer," I said, maintaining direct eye contact. "I will be sure to remember your incredible generosity." Chloe smirked, clearly satisfied that she had put me in my place. "Good. Now try not to embarrass us inside. The Kensingtons are old money, Simone. Try not to speak unless spoken to. And please do not bore anyone with stories about the DM5, or the courthouse, or wherever it is you work." I followed them through the grand brass doors into the opulent lobby of the country club. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted filet mignon. The dining room was reserved entirely for the Kensington family and their elite circle. We were led to a massive private dining hall with a long mahogany table set with fine china and crystal glassware. As we took our seats, I watched the dynamics unfold. My parents were seated near the middle of the table, constantly leaning forward, laughing too hard at every joke Spencer's father, Richard Kensington, made. Richard was a formidable man, with a booming voice and a ruthless reputation in the corporate world. His pharmaceutical company was worth billions, but I knew something about Richard that no one else at the table knew. I knew that his company was currently under federal investigation for massive financial fraud, and the case had just been assigned to my docket. I sat quietly at the end of the table, sipping my sparkling water, watching my family grovel. My mother was busy praising Chloe loudly, talking about how Chloe was going to make such a beautiful high society wife. My father was practically begging Richard for investment advice. It was a masterclass in sycophancy. Every so often, Chloe would shoot me a look of pure disdain, as if my mere presence was a stain on her perfect evening. I knew what was coming next. This dinner was not just about celebrating an engagement. My family had an ulterior motive for inviting me, and I was just waiting for them to drop the act. Growing up, I had always been the one who played by the rules. I did my chores, studied until my eyes blurred, and earned academic scholarships to prestigious universities. But none of that mattered to Valerie and Desmond. In their eyes, success was defined by proximity to power and wealth, not by personal achievement. When Chloe barely graduated college and immediately started dating wealthy men, they celebrated her as a genius. When I graduated at the top of my law school class, they complained that my graduation ceremony took too long and made them miss their dinner reservations. Their favoritism was not just emotional, it was systemic. They had funded Chloe's lavish lifestyle, paying for her designer clothes, her luxury apartments, and her constant vacations, all while claiming they could not afford to help me with my student loans. I had built my life entirely on my own. I had clawed my way up the legal ladder, facing discrimination and bias at every turn, relying solely on my intellect and grit. The only person who had ever truly believed in me was my grandmother. Before she passed away, she had seen the truth of our family dynamic. She knew my parents would eventually try to strip me of everything to benefit Chloe. That was why she left her historic $1 million property solely to me. As the waiters began to clear the appetizer plates, replacing them with dishes of caviar and truffles, the conversation around the table shifted. The jovial laughter died down, replaced by a forced, tense seriousness. Chloe reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She slid it down the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of my plate. I looked at the envelope, then up at Chloe. "What is this?" I asked calmly. Chloe leaned back in her chair, swirling her champagne glass. "It is a standard quitclaim deed, Simone. Spencer and I are looking to buy a permanent estate in the Hamptons. His family is contributing a massive amount of capital, and it is only right that my family contributes as well." I did not touch the envelope. "Contributes how exactly?" My father cleared his throat, adjusting his tie nervously under the gaze of the Kensington patriarch. "Your grandmother left you that old house, Simone. You do not need it. You are a single woman working a desk job. Chloe is entering high society. We have had a lawyer draft up the papers. You just need to sign over the deed to Chloe so we can sell the property and use the funds for her estate. It is for the good of the family." I stared at my father, letting his words hang in the air. The absolute audacity of the request was staggering. They had invited me to this dinner, humiliated me at the door, tipped me $100 like a beggar, and were now demanding I sign over a $1.5 million property so my sister could buy a mansion with a billionaire heir. Spencer leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Look, Simone," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "We know you do not have much going on in your life. We are willing to give you a small cut of the sale. Say $20,000. That should be more than enough to pay off whatever credit card debt you have, and maybe buy a nicer car. You really should not be driving that old thing to a club like this anyway." My mother nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Simone. $20,000 is a fortune for someone in your position. Do not be selfish. Your sister needs this to secure her future. The Kensingtons need to know we bring real value to this marriage." I finally picked up the envelope. I did not open it immediately. I just held it in my hands, feeling the weight of the paper. I could feel the eyes of everyone at the table boring into me. Richard Kensington was watching me with a look of mild amusement, clearly enjoying the pathetic display of my family tearing each other apart for his approval. I slowly opened the flap and pulled out the legal documents. I scanned the first page. It was a poorly drafted contract full of glaring legal loopholes that any first-year law student could spot. They really thought I was just a clueless admin. They really thought I would just sign away my inheritance out of guilt and intimidation. I placed the documents back on the table and picked up my pen. My parents smiled, thinking they had won. Chloe let out a triumphant little laugh, already planning how to spend the money. But I did not sign the paper. Instead, I began marking the documents, circling the legal errors with red ink. Before I could speak, the doors to the private dining room swung open violently. A man in a sharp suit rushed in, leaning down to whisper frantically into Richard Kensington's ear. Richard's face instantly turned purple with rage. He slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. "What do you mean our accounts are frozen?" Richard roared, completely ignoring the stunned silence of the room. "I pay you millions of dollars to handle this. You told me the judge would be lenient." The man in the suit looked terrified. "Sir, the new federal judge just signed the order. We are completely locked out of the offshore accounts." My mother Valerie did not miss a beat. As soon as the words left my mouth, refusing to be their valet, she closed the distance between us. Her manicured fingers clamped down on my forearm, her acrylic nails digging sharply into my skin, through the silk of my dress. She pulled me close so the Kensingtons could not hear her voice, dropping to a venomous hiss. "Do not embarrass your sister in front of this family, Simone. You are just a lowly admin at the courthouse. Would it kill you to help her out for one night?" I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, then back up to her face. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate energy. This was classic Valerie. My parents had spent their entire lives chasing a phantom of high society. My father Desmond was a mid-level manager who spent his weekends at golf courses he could barely afford, trying to rub elbows with men who did not even know his name. My mother treated social climbing like an Olympic sport. To them, Chloe was not just a daughter. She was a calculated investment. With her light skin, her chemically straightened hair, and her willingness to mold herself into whatever a wealthy man wanted, she was their golden ticket. They had poured every ounce of their emotional and financial resources into her, grooming her for a moment exactly like this. Meanwhile, I was the dark-skinned daughter with natural hair who chose public service over country club mixers. I was the stain on their perfect aspirational portrait. I had worked 3 jobs to put myself through law school, a graduation ceremony they did not even attend because Chloe had a minor breakup the same weekend and needed emotional support. They had written me off years ago as a failure because I refused to play their game. "Let go of my arm," I said softly. My voice was calm, but the authority in it made my mother flinch. She released me, but her glare remained. "Fix your attitude," she whispered harshly. "You are lucky they even allowed you to come tonight. Do not ruin this for Chloe." She turned on her heel and hurried after my father, who was already practically jogging to catch up with Richard Spencer's billionaire father. My father was laughing loudly at a joke Richard had not even finished telling. It was a pathetic display of sycophancy. I took a deep breath, smoothed the invisible wrinkle from my sleeve, and followed them through the heavy brass doors of the country club. The interior was a fortress of old money. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over mahogany paneling and antique oil paintings. The air smelled of expensive perfume, roasted meats, and absolute privilege. As we walked through the opulent lobby toward the private dining rooms, my mother strategically fell back to walk beside me. She could not resist twisting the knife a little deeper. "Why could you not just play along?" she muttered, keeping her fake smile plastered on her face for the passing guests. "Spencer was being nice to you. He offered you $100. You know how hard things have been for us lately. You could have parked the car, kept the money, and showed them that our family is accommodating." I kept my eyes straight ahead. I knew exactly why things had been hard for them lately. They had remortgaged their own house to pay for Chloe's extravagant engagement party, desperate to match the Kensingtons' wealth and prove they belonged in this circle. They were drowning in debt to keep up an illusion of grandeur, while I owned my properties outright. Of course, they knew nothing of my financial status. They assumed I was barely surviving on a clerical salary. We entered the private dining room. It was massive, with a long, polished table set with fine china and heavy silver flatware. The seating arrangement immediately revealed the hierarchy of the night. My parents practically fought to sit closer to Richard and Spencer's mother, a frosty woman who barely acknowledged their presence. I was directed to the far end of the table, seated next to a potted fern, as far away from the center of attention as physically possible. Once everyone was seated, and the first round of expensive vintage wine was poured, the real manipulation began. The Kensingtons were polite but distant, carrying a subtle air of superiority that my parents were too desperate to notice. Every conversation was dominated by wealth acquisitions and status. Chloe looked down the table at me, a malicious glint in her eye. "So, Simone, how is the filing going at the courthouse? Are you still swimming in parking tickets and paperwork?" The table grew quiet. Spencer chuckled softly, swirling the wine in his glass. My father, Desmond, laughed nervously, eager to join in the mockery if it meant bonding with the wealthy in-laws. "You know Simone, Richard, she has always been the stubborn one. We tried to get her into corporate law years ago, maybe as a paralegal, but she insisted on pushing papers for the government. No ambition, that one. But Chloe is our star. She has the vision." Valerie chimed in, immediately nodding her head. "Oh yes. Chloe has always had a natural grace. Simone always wanted to do things the hard way. Sticking with that little government job. We worry about her future, honestly. With no husband and no real career trajectory, it is just a dead end." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. It was fascinating, really, to sit there and be dissected by people who had not asked me a single question about my life in 5 years. They were completely unaware that the little government job they were mocking was one of the highest legal authorities in the region. They did not know about the high-profile cases I had prosecuted, the late nights poring over constitutional law, or the grueling confirmation hearings. They were so blinded by their own prejudice that they could not see the power sitting right at their table. Spencer leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, looking at me with feigned pity. We do have some openings in the corporate mailroom, Simone. Good benefits. Health insurance. I could put in a word with human resources if you are struggling. It would be a step up from the municipal building. My mother kicked me under the table. Say thank you, she hissed under her breath. I smiled faintly, looking directly into Spencer's eyes. Thank you, Spencer. But I am quite satisfied with my current position. I assure you my benefits are excellent. Chloe scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. Satisfied making 40,000 a year. Please. You are just too proud to accept help. You have always been jealous of me, and tonight just proves it. You could not even park a car without making it a huge dramatic issue. You are a grown woman, Simone. It is time to stop being so bitter and start contributing to this family. Contributing. That was the magic word. The entire evening had been a setup. My parents had not invited me here out of a sudden desire for family unity. They had not brought me here to celebrate. They had brought me here to break me down, to humiliate me in front of billionaires, so that when they asked for what they really wanted, I would be too small and embarrassed to say no. I watched as Chloe reached down and picked up her oversized designer handbag from the floor. I knew my grandmother had been right. Before she passed away, my grandmother warned me that my parents would eventually try to strip me of everything I had to benefit Chloe. That was why she left her historic $1 million property solely in my name, bypassing my parents entirely. It was a fortress they had been trying to breach for 2 years. Chloe pulled a thick manila envelope from her bag and tossed it onto the polished mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. The main course had not even arrived yet, but the true feast was about to begin. They thought they were cornering a helpless administrative assistant. They had no idea they were laying a trap for a federal judge. The heavy thud of the manila envelope hitting the table still echoed in my ears. I looked at the thick yellow paper, then up at Chloe, whose face was stretched into a victorious and condescending smirk. Before I could even ask what was inside the envelope, Spencer decided it was his moment to perform for his father and assert his dominance over me. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick silver money clip bulging with large bills. He peeled off a crisp and new $100 bill. With an arrogant flick of his wrist, he tossed it across the polished mahogany table. It landed right on top of the manila envelope, directly in front of my plate. I know things are tight for you right now, Simone, Spencer said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms over his chest. Chloe tells me you are still doing admin work down at the county building. Rent is coming up on the 1st of the month, right? Take it. Consider it an advance on whatever allowance your parents still give you. Buy yourself a decent meal and do not let pride keep you starving. The sheer disrespect of the gesture should have shocked my parents. Instead, my father Desmond let out a loud and booming laugh as if Spencer had just delivered a brilliant punchline. My mother Valerie nodded enthusiastically, her eyes darting between Richard Kensington and Spencer, to ensure they saw her approval of their charity. Go ahead and take it, Simone, my mother urged, her voice dripping with a fake sweetness that made my stomach turn. Spencer is just being generous to you. You know you have been complaining about the cost of groceries and living expenses. I had never complained about groceries to her. I had a highly diversified investment portfolio and a salary that placed me in the top earning percentile of the state. But Valerie needed to paint me as the destitute and struggling spinster to make Chloe's catch look even more spectacular to the billionaires sitting across from us. The optics of the situation were sickening. A wealthy and privileged white man was throwing a single bill at a 35-year-old black woman, treating her like a charity case, while her own black parents applauded the degradation just to secure their spot in high society. I did not react with anger. Anger was a tool for people who had lost control of a situation, and I was entirely in control. I calmly reached out and picked up the $100 bill. I smoothed out a small crease in the corner, holding it up slightly to the light of the crystal chandelier above us. Thank you, Spencer, I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I will keep this as a souvenir for today. It will be a perfect reminder of exactly who you are. Spencer smirked, completely missing the heavy threat laced in my words. Glad I could help out, sweetheart, he replied smoothly. Do not spend it all in one place. Richard Kensington, who had been quietly observing the exchange while sipping a glass of expensive bourbon, finally spoke up. That is the fundamental problem with your generation, he said, pointing a thick and ringed finger in my direction. You have absolutely no drive. You settle for these little government jobs pushing papers at a desk, just waiting for a pension to save you. My son Spencer here is about to close a corporate merger that will double our family assets. Chloe understands value, she understands ambition and how the real world works. You could learn a lot from your younger sister if you paid attention. I looked directly at Richard. His face was slightly flushed, and the veins in his neck were pronounced. He projected the image of an untouchable titan of industry, but my trained eyes caught the subtle signs of a man under immense psychological stress. His grip on his crystal glass was entirely too tight. He kept glancing at his phone, which lay face down next to his plate. He had absolutely no idea that the massive corporate merger he was bragging about was currently frozen by a federal injunction. An injunction that bore my exact signature from earlier that morning. Chloe, eager to steer the spotlight back to her triumph, tapped her manicured fingernail against the manila envelope. Anyway, let us get down to business, she said briskly. Spencer and I have a very tight schedule, and we are flying to Paris tomorrow for a pre-wedding celebration. Open the envelope, Simone. Just then, a line of servers entered the private room carrying large silver trays. They moved with practiced silence, placing plates of seared scallops, wagyu beef, and roasted root vegetables in front of everyone. The aroma of rich sauces and expensive herbs filled the room. The opulence of the meal was a stark contrast to the absolute ugliness of the people consuming it. My mother immediately began fawning over the beautiful presentation, while my father asked the sommelier to pour more of the $2,000 wine Richard had ordered. They were gorging themselves on the Kensington's wealth, perfectly willing to serve me up on a silver platter to pay for their seats at the table. I ignored the food. I folded the $100 bill exactly in half and slid it into my designer clutch, snapping it shut with a definitive click. Then I picked up the manila envelope. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the toxic entitlement my family had nurtured for decades. I peeled back the metal clasp and slid out the documents. The header at the top of the first page was printed in bold and black letters. Quitclaim deed and transfer of property. It was exactly what my grandmother had warned me about. Below the header was the legal address of my grandmother's historic brownstone property. It was a beautiful piece of real estate she had explicitly left to me, knowing my parents would squander it if they ever got their hands on the deed. While you were busy filing parking tickets or whatever it is you do all day, my lawyers drafted this up, Chloe explained, picking up her silver fork and delicately cutting into her scallops. Since Spencer is bringing so much financial power to this marriage, our parents agreed that I need a substantial asset of my own to bring to the table. That old house is completely wasted on you, Simone. You do not entertain guests. You do not have a family or a husband. You just sit in that big house all alone. It is the right thing to do, Valerie added, not even looking at me as she chewed her food. We have all sacrificed for this family. Now it is your turn to step up. Once you sign the property over to Chloe, she can sell it to a commercial developer. The money will go toward her new estate in the Hamptons. We are talking about building a lasting legacy, Simone. Something much bigger than your selfish little life. I read through the first few paragraphs of the legal document. It was genuinely laughable. Chloe's bargain basement lawyers had used a generic template downloaded from the internet. The clauses were sloppy, the property description was legally ambiguous, and the coercion tactics were so blatant they practically leaped off the page. They honestly believed that because I worked at a courthouse, I was just a glorified secretary who would be intimidated by a few pages of dense legal jargon. And what happens if I refuse to sign this flawed document? I asked, flipping casually to the second page. My father slammed his fist down on the table, making the silverware rattle against the fine china. "You will not refuse," Desmond growled, his face twisting with sudden rage. "You will stop being a difficult and ungrateful daughter for once in your miserable life and do what is best for your sister. If you do not sign that paper tonight, you can forget about ever calling yourself a part of this family again. We will cut you off completely, and you will be entirely on your own. Cut me off." The threat was almost comical. I had been financially independent since I was 20 years old. I had paid for my own education, bought my own cars, and funded my own political campaigns. They had never given me a single dime in my adult life, yet they were threatening to withdraw a support system that did not even exist. Spencer chuckled, taking a long sip of his red wine. "Look at her, Chloe. She is actually reading it like she understands the legal terms. Just show her where the signature line is before she gives herself a headache trying to sound out the big words." I did not get a headache. In fact, for the first time all evening, I felt a genuine and cold smile form on my lips. I set the documents down flat on the table and reached into my clutch. I pulled out a sleek gold pen. The sight of the pen made Chloe sit up straighter, a greedy gleam appearing in her eyes. She thought she had won. They all thought they had broken me down to my proper place. I held the sleek gold pen suspended over the signature line. Chloe leaned forward, her eyes practically vibrating with greed, waiting for me to hand over $1 million asset. But instead of touching the ink to the paper, I deliberately set the pen down next to my crystal water glass. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. "I think I will read the fine print while we eat," I said calmly. "A contract of this magnitude requires a thorough review." Chloe let out a sharp, frustrated sigh, rolling her eyes at Spencer. My father, terrified that my delay might offend our wealthy hosts, immediately jumped in to smooth over the tension. He waved his hand dismissively in my direction, laughing a little too loudly. Of course, let her read," Desmond said, his voice dripping with forced joviality. "Simone always was a slow reader. She has to double-check everything twice just to understand it. But let us not focus on boring administrative matters. Spencer, my boy Richard was just telling me about your latest acquisition in the biotech sector. Absolutely brilliant move. You have a mind for business that is simply unmatched." Spencer leaned back, swirling his expensive wine, soaking up my father's praise like a sponge. "Well, Desmond, when you are dealing with international markets, you have to be aggressive. It is about understanding the global economic flow. Not that I would expect you to grasp the nuances of offshore corporate structuring, but you have done quite well for yourself considering your background. It is commendable, really, how far you have come with a standard public school education." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. He had essentially just called my father uneducated and simple, wrapping the insult in a thin veil of polite conversation. But Desmond, blinded by the glare of the Kensington fortune, did not even flinch. In fact, he smiled wider, nodding vigorously. "Thank you, Spencer," my father replied earnestly. "We have worked hard to get to the middle class, but we know our limits. That is why we are so thrilled Chloe found someone like you to elevate her." I took a slow sip of my water to hide the disgust on my face. It was physically painful to watch my own parents strip themselves of all dignity just to be allowed in the same room as these people. They were serving themselves up as the grateful, submissive minority, completely oblivious to the contempt radiating from the other side of the table. Richard Kensington wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and turned his gaze to my mother, Valerie. "And you must be very proud of Chloe, Valerie. She is a very impressive young woman, very articulate. She does not have any of that aggressive attitude you so often see these days from people in your community. She fits right in at the club. You would almost forget where she comes from." My mother beamed, her chest swelling with pride. "Oh, thank you, Richard. We always taught Chloe to speak properly and present herself with class. We wanted to make sure she could assimilate into any environment. We always knew she was meant for high society." I stared at my mother, genuinely horrified. Richard had just delivered a textbook racist microaggression praising Chloe for being the acceptable, watered-down version of a black woman, and Valerie was thanking him for it. She viewed her own racial identity as a hurdle that Chloe had successfully overcome, a hurdle she clearly believed I had tripped over. Spencer reached over and patted Chloe's hand affectionately. She really is one of the good ones, he agreed, grinning. Not like her sister here, who seems determined to make everything a struggle. Honestly, Simone, you could learn a lot from Chloe. She knows how to adapt. She knows how to make people comfortable. You sitting there analyzing a simple real estate document like you are some hotshot lawyer, it just makes you look bitter. Chloe smirked, emboldened by Spencer's defense. Simone has always had a chip on her shoulder. She thinks because she reads a few legal briefs at the county clerk office she is suddenly an expert. It is embarrassing. I kept my face perfectly neutral, silently observing the psychological rot of the people sitting around me. They were a perfect toxic ecosystem. The Kensingtons needed people like my parents to feel superior to validate their white savior complexes. And my parents needed the Kensingtons to validate their lifelong obsession with proximity to whiteness and wealth. Chloe was just the currency they were using to complete the transaction. And me? I was the contrast. I was the dark-skinned, natural-haired scapegoat they could point to and say, "Look, we are not like her." "It is fascinating how you view success, Spencer," I said, my voice cutting through the smug atmosphere at the table. "You measure ambition entirely by proximity to capital. You assume that because I work in public service, I must lack drive." Spencer laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Oh, come on, Simone. Let us be real. Nobody works for the government because they have drive. They work for the government because they cannot survive in the private sector. It is a safety net for the mediocre. You stamp forms, you file documents, you go home at 5 o'clock, and you wait for your pension. There is no risk. There is no power." Richard chuckled in agreement, slicing into his Wagyu beef. "The boy is right. True power lies in the private sector. True power is controlling the capital that runs the city, not pushing the paper that regulates it. People like us build the world. People like you just try to slow us down with red tape." My father leaned forward, desperate to shut me down before I angered his idols. "Simone, that is enough. Do not argue with Richard and Spencer about things you do not understand. You have absolutely no idea what it takes to run a massive corporation. You have never managed anything more complicated than a filing cabinet. Just eat your food and be quiet." I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had completely abandoned his role as a protector to become a cheerleader for the men who openly mocked his intelligence. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of pity for him, but it was quickly swallowed by a cold, calculating resolve. "You are right, Dad," I said softly. "I do not run a corporation." "Good," Valerie snapped, glaring at me. "Then stop acting like you are the smartest person in the room. You are embarrassing yourself. Now pick up that pen and sign the document so we can enjoy the rest of our evening in peace." I rested my hand on the table right next to the gold pen. I was not embarrassed. I was taking mental notes. Every condescending remark, every admission of arrogant superiority, every subtle insult was being filed away in my mind. Spencer and Richard were bragging about their untouchable power, completely oblivious to the fact that their corporate empire was built on a foundation of sand, and I was the one holding the tidal wave. They believed that because they had money, the law did not apply to them. They believed that people in public service were just weak bureaucrats waiting to be bought or bullied. They had absolutely no idea the kind of authority I wielded. They had no idea that when I put on my black robe, I was the ultimate arbiter of their fate. I watched Spencer take another arrogant sip of his wine, laughing at something Chloe whispered in his ear. "Enjoy the wine, Spencer," I thought to myself. "It might be the last decent vintage you have for a very long time." The table fell into a rhythm of clinking silverware and superficial chatter. They had successfully put me in my place, or so they thought. My parents were relaxed again, their faces flushed with expensive alcohol and the thrill of being accepted by their betters. Chloe was practically glowing, eyeing the manila envelope as if the $1 million were already in her bank account. I just sat there in silence, waiting. I knew what was coming. The gears of the justice system were already in motion, and it was only a matter of time before they crashed straight into this private dining room. and just as the waiters approached to clear the main course plates, the heavy wooden doors of the VIP suite swung open. My mother Valerie did not miss a beat. As soon as the words left my mouth, refusing to be their valet, she closed the distance between us. Her manicured fingers clamped down on my forearm, her acrylic nails digging sharply into my skin through the silk of my dress. She pulled me close so the Kensingtons could not hear her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. The heavy wooden doors of the VIP suite swung open, but it was not the waitstaff returning with the next course. A short, balding man in a cheap gray suit shuffled into the room, clutching a worn leather briefcase to his chest. He looked entirely out of place among the crystal chandeliers and the Kensington family wealth. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, looking around nervously, until his eyes landed on my sister. Chloe sat up straight, a radiant and predatory smile spreading across her face. She waved the man over. "Right on time, Mr. Higgins," she announced loudly, making sure she had the attention of everyone at the table. My parents exchanged confused glances, but Spencer simply smirked, clearly in on whatever scheme my sister had concocted. I looked at the man, then down at the manila envelope containing the quitclaim deed that was still sitting near my plate. I immediately knew exactly who this man was, and why he was here. The sheer calculation of it all was almost impressive, if it were not so thoroughly pathetic. Chloe turned to Richard and Spencer's mother, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Spencer and I want everything to be perfect for this union. We want to ensure that our families are joined not just in love, but in mutual respect and equal standing." Then she turned her gaze back to me, the sweetness instantly evaporating, replaced by a cold and hard demand. She tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the legal document on the table. "That is why Mr. Higgins is here. He is a public notary. We are getting this finalized tonight, Simone." I looked at the notary, who was awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Then I looked at Chloe. "You brought a notary to an engagement dinner?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Spencer does not lack money, Simone," Chloe declared, her voice echoing in the large room. "We all know that. But the Kensington family needs to see that we have matching assets. They need to know that we are bringing a proper foundation to this marriage. This is about optics and generational wealth. You are 35 years old. You are entirely single. You have no prospects, and you are doing absolutely nothing with your life. You do not need a historic $1.5 million property just to sit alone in it with your government paperwork. You are going to sign that house over to me so I can use it as my dowry." The word dowry hung in the air, heavy and archaic. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The property she was casually referring to as a bargaining chip for her rich white in-laws was not just a house. It was a massive historic brownstone in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. More importantly, it was the house our grandmother Estelle had scrubbed floors for decades to buy. Grandmother Estelle was a fierce, independent black woman who bought that property during a time when banks routinely denied loans to people who looked like her. She had poured her blood and sweat into every brick of that home. She had explicitly left it to me because she knew I would preserve its history, and she knew exactly what Chloe and my parents would do to it if they ever got their hands on the deed. They would liquidate our ancestors' sacrifice to buy a ticket into a world that would never truly respect them. My mother Valerie leaned across the table, her eyes wide with frantic urgency. "Simone, do not be stubborn. Chloe is right. What do you need a house that big for anyway? The neighborhood is changing, property taxes are going up, and you are just an administrative assistant. You cannot afford the upkeep on a place like that long term. We are doing you a favor by taking it off your hands." A favor? I stared at my mother, marveling at her ability to wrap theft and extortion in a blanket of maternal concern. I owned the house outright. I paid the property taxes a year in advance from my investment dividends. But again, I let them believe their own delusions. Spencer chuckled, reaching out to pour himself another glass of wine. "Listen to your mother, Simone. It is just business. Chloe is stepping into a different tier of society now. She needs capital to match the Kensington name. You should be proud to contribute to her success. I mean, think about it. Without this marriage, your family does not exactly have a legacy to speak of. This is your chance to be useful. The sheer racism and classism woven into Spencer's words were staggering. He was openly stating that my family had no legacy until he graciously allowed my sister to marry him. And my father, Desmond, instead of defending his own mother's legacy, simply nodded in agreement. He is right, Simone, my father said sternly, trying to project authority for the wealthy men watching him. We have indulged your independence long enough. This is family business. You will sign the quitclaim deed right now. Mr. Higgins will notarize it, and we will put this whole ugly matter behind us so we can celebrate your sister's future. Mr. Higgins. The sweaty notary pulled a heavy metal stamp and a logbook from his briefcase. He placed them on the table near my plate, avoiding my eyes. He clicked his pen and held it out to me. Just sign on the dotted line at the bottom of page 3, Ma. He mumbled, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. And I will need your thumbprint in my book. I did not take the pen. I sat perfectly still, observing the trap they thought they had so cleverly sprung. They had cornered me in a private room, surrounded me with billionaires to make me feel small, brought my own parents to apply emotional leverage, and hired a notary to make the extortion legally binding on the spot. It was a coordinated ambush. I turned my attention to the man standing nervously beside me. Mr. Higgins. Is it? I asked, keeping my tone conversational. Yes, Ma, am, he replied, startled by the direct address. I reached out and picked up the quitclaim deed, holding it casually. Are you familiar with the legal definitions of coercion and signing under duress, Mr. Higgins? The room suddenly went very still. Mr. Higgins swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Excuse me. I continued, my voice smooth, but carrying a razor-sharp edge. As a licensed notary public in this state, your primary duty is to verify that the signer is executing the document willingly and without intimidation. Yet you were hired to ambush a guest at a private dinner party where multiple individuals are currently demanding that I forfeit a $1.5 million asset against my will. If you place your official seal on this document under these circumstances, you are not just an impartial witness. You are an active participant in fraud and extortion. Mr. Higgins physically took a step back from the table. The color drained completely from his face. I was just told to come here to witness a standard family property transfer, he stammered, looking frantically at Chloe. They did not say anything about a dispute. Chloe slammed her hands on the table, her face twisting in rage. Stop trying to scare him with your fake legal jargon, Simone. You do not know what you are talking about. You are a glorified secretary. Mr. Higgins, ignore her. She is just being dramatic. But Mr. Higgins was already packing his stamp back into his leather briefcase. He might not have known exactly who I was, but he recognized the undeniable tone of someone who knew the law better than anyone else in the room. I am sorry, miss, he said to Chloe, his hands shaking slightly as he closed his bag. The lady has explicitly stated she is under duress. My license is on the line. I cannot legally notarize this signature. Get back here, my father shouted, half rising from his chair, as Mr. Higgins practically sprinted out the heavy wooden doors, leaving them swinging in his wake. The silence that followed was suffocating. Chloe stood there, her chest heaving, her grand plan crumbling before her eyes. Spencer looked mildly annoyed, as if I had just spilled wine on his favorite rug, rather than halted a $1 million theft. Richard Kensington let out a deep, booming sigh of irritation. For God's sake, Desmond, can you not control your own daughter? We have millions of dollars moving in the corporate accounts this week, and we are sitting here watching you squabble over a single house. If the girl will not sign, then force her. My mother. Valerie turned to me, her eyes filled with a venomous hatred that took my breath away. You have ruined everything, she hissed, her voice vibrating with pure malice. You have always been jealous of Chloe. You have always wanted to destroy her happiness because nobody wants you. If you do not sign that paper right now, you are dead to us. Do you hear me? You will never set foot in our home again. You will be a stranger. I looked at my mother, feeling the last remaining thread of my attachment to this family finally snap. It did not break with a loud noise or a burst of tears. It simply dissolved into nothing. They were willing to discard me completely over a piece of property. They were willing to sacrifice my future to buy the approval of a corrupt billionaire and his arrogant son. I picked up the quitclaim deed. Chloe leaned forward, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes, thinking her mother's threat had finally broken my resolve. I held the document with both hands right down the center, and then, with a slow and deliberate motion, I tore the thick pages in half. The sound of the thick parchment tearing echoed like a gunshot in the silent VIP dining room. The two halves of the quitclaim deed fluttered onto the mahogany table, landing right next to my untouched plate of Wagyu beef. For a fraction of a second, nobody breathed. The sheer shock of my defiance temporarily paralyzed everyone in the room. Then the explosion happened. Chloe's face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage. She lunged forward as if she wanted to strike me across the table, but Spencer quickly put a firm hand on her arm to hold her back. She snatched her oversized designer bag from the floor, her hands shaking violently as she reached inside. She pulled out another pristine manila envelope and slammed it down in front of me. "Did you really think I only brought one copy, you absolute idiot?" Chloe shrieked, her perfectly curated high society persona completely dissolving into a tantrum. "Tearing up a piece of paper changes absolutely nothing. You are going to sign this, Simone." My mother Valerie slammed both of her hands flat on the table, leaning so far forward she was almost out of her chair. "How long are you going to be this selfish?" she screamed, completely ignoring the billionaire audience they had been so desperate to impress all night. "We gave you life. We put a roof over your head when you were a child. And this is how you repay us. By trying to sabotage your own sister's future out of pure, unadulterated jealousy." Jealousy. The word hung in the air, incredibly toxic and entirely delusional. My father Desmond pointed a shaking, accusing finger at my face. "You are 35 years old, and you have absolutely nothing to show for your life but a miserable attitude. Your sister is about to become a Kensington. She is elevating this entire family to a level you could never even dream of reaching. You are supposed to sacrifice for her. That is what family does, Simone. We sacrifice for the greater good. But you have always been obsessed with yourself. You have always been a bitter disappointment." The psychological manipulation poured out of them like a dark, suffocating wave. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. They were aggressively framing my refusal to be robbed as an act of malicious sabotage. They were demanding I hand over my legally inherited $1 million asset to a sister who had never worked a hard day in her life, all to fund her dowry for a family of corrupt billionaires. Valerie continued, deciding to twist history to inflict maximum emotional damage. "Do you honestly think Grandmother Estelle wanted you to hoard that property like a dragon? She would be disgusted with you right now. She wanted this family to succeed. Chloe needs that house to prove her worth. Spencer's family needs to know we are not just a bunch of poor dependents looking for a handout. You are humiliating us in front of Richard. You are acting like a lonely, spiteful woman who cannot stand to see her own flesh and blood be happy." They were using the memory of the only person who had ever truly loved me as a weapon to induce guilt. It was vile. It was the exact reason I had spent the last 5 years distancing myself from their poison. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, and I did not defend myself against their fabricated narrative. Arguing with narcissists is like pouring water into a bottomless pit. Instead, I calmly reached out and pulled the second copy of the contract from the new envelope. I smoothed the fresh pages out flat on the mahogany table. Spencer let out a harsh, mocking laugh, taking a long drink of his wine. "Look at her. She is actually reading it again. Just sign the damn paper, Simone. Stop throwing a tantrum, swallow your pride, and accept your place in the family hierarchy. You are making a fool of yourself." I ignored him entirely. I let the chaotic noise of their screaming fade into the background as I let my professional training take over. Earlier, I had only glanced at the first page, but now, under the barrage of their verbal abuse, I subjected the document to a rigorous legal analysis. With the trained eyes of a top legal expert, the sheer incompetence of the drafting became glaringly obvious. It was genuinely embarrassing. Chloe's cut-rate lawyers had clearly downloaded a generic property transfer template from a sketchy website and tried to forcefully insert high-net-worth corporate terminology they clearly did not understand. In Clause 3, they had misidentified the parcel number of the property. By signing this specific document, I would not be signing over my historic brownstone at all. I would be legally transferring the ownership of an empty city-owned dirt lot 3 streets down. It got worse. In Clause 7, they had included a penalty condition stating that if I ever contested the transfer in the future, I would instantly owe Spencer's corporate holding company $500,000. This was entirely unenforceable and bordered strictly on criminal extortion. Most hilariously, the contract explicitly stated in the preamble that the property transfer was a mandatory requirement for the marriage to proceed. In this state, legally categorizing a property transfer under a coercive marital conditional agreement made the entire document instantly voidable in any court of law. It was not a binding legal contract. It was a poorly spelled ransom note, dressed up in Times New Roman font. They honestly believed that because I worked at a courthouse, I was just a low-level administrative clerk who would be terrified by dense legal jargon. They had no idea that I spent my days striking down multi-million-dollar corporate litigations crafted by the most expensive and ruthless law firms in the country. This piece of paper was a joke. "Are you even listening to me?" my mother shrieked. Her face flushed red with indignation, her voice breaking my concentration. "You owe us this, Simone. You owe Chloe. If you walk out of this room without signing that paper, you are dead to me. Do you understand? I will tell everyone in our community what a spiteful and toxic person you are. You will have no one. You will die alone." I looked up from the flawed contract. The dining room was thick with tension. Richard Kensington was tapping his heavy gold watch against the table, clearly annoyed that this peasant drama was cutting into his expensive evening. Spencer was glaring at me with open disgust, waiting for me to submit. My parents were breathing heavily, staring at me with a desperate predatory hunger, waiting for my spirit to finally break under the crushing weight of their combined guilt trip. I picked up my crystal water glass, took a slow, refreshing sip, and let a genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face. "This document," I said, softly tapping the pristine white paper with my index finger, "is the most legally illiterate piece of garbage I have ever had the displeasure of reading. Even if I wanted to give you the house, which I absolutely do not, this contract would not hold up in a small claims court, let alone a federal one." Chloe opened her mouth to scream again, her face turning a deep shade of purple. But before a single sound could leave her lips, a sharp and frantic knocking echoed through the room, instantly shattering the tension. The heavy mahogany doors flew open with such violent force that they slammed against the paneled walls. The sharp knocking had not been a polite request to enter. It had been one of Richard Kensington's corporate fixers trying to warn him before he lost his mind. Richard stormed back into the VIP dining room. He had stepped out into the hallway 5 minutes prior to take what he claimed was a routine business call, leaving us to our petty family squabble over my property. Now the composed and arrogant billionaire was completely gone. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, and the veins in his thick neck bulged against his silk collar. He had his custom smartphone pressed tightly to his ear, and he was screaming so loudly that flecks of spit flew from his lips. "I do not care what time it is, Marcus!" Richard roared into the phone, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "You get down to the basement archives right now, and you shred every single ledger connected to the Cayman Shell companies. Do you hear me? Every single one." My mother let out a tiny, terrified gasp and sank lower into her chair. My father, who had been shouting at me just seconds before, instantly turned pale and rigid. They were witnessing the ugly criminal underbelly of the elite world they so desperately wanted to join, and it terrified them to their core. Chloe sat completely frozen, her mouth slightly open, her tantrum over the torn contract entirely forgotten. Spencer immediately jumped up from his chair, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "Dad," Spencer hissed, rushing over to him and grabbing his arm. "Dad, calm down. What is going on?" We are in the middle of a private dinner. Richard violently yanked his arm out of his son's grasp. To hell with the dinner, Spencer, he barked, covering the receiver of his phone for a split second. The feds just raided the downtown office. They are freezing the accounts. He pulled his hand away and screamed back into the phone. Listen to me, Marcus. The Black Fund is not secure. If they find the unredacted tax files from the third quarter, I am looking at 20 years in federal prison. I need those servers wiped clean. Take a magnet to the hard drives. Burn the paper trails. Do it now. He ended the call, slamming the phone down onto the dining table so hard the crystal water glasses rattled. He began pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug like a caged animal. Dad, keep your voice down, Spencer whispered frantically, casting a nervous glance toward my parents and me. You cannot talk about the black funds out loud. Not in front of them. Richard stopped pacing and glared at my family with absolute unmasked disgust. It was the look a man gives a swarm of gnats that had flown into his house. Them? Richard sneered, waving a dismissive hand at my parents. You think I care about them right now? Look at them, Spencer. A mid-level manager and his social climbing wife. And the sister who pushes papers at the county courthouse. What are they going to do? They do not understand half the words I just said. They are nobody. My parents sat in stunned silence. The absolute disrespect was a physical blow. Richard had just explicitly told them that they were entirely insignificant, that their presence mattered so little. He felt comfortable ordering the destruction of federal evidence right in front of their faces. They had spent their entire lives bowing to white wealth, and this was their reward. Total humiliating invisibility. But Richard was wrong about one thing. He was wrong about me. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting neatly in my lap. My face remained an impassive mask, but internally my mind was racing with razor-sharp precision. I was not just listening. I was actively transcribing every single syllable he uttered into my mental legal ledger. Shred every single ledger. That was Title 18, United States Code Section 1519. Destruction, alteration, or falsification of records in federal investigations. The Black Fund is not secure. That was an open, spontaneous admission of tax evasion and corporate fraud. He had just confessed to a litany of federal crimes, and he had done it in a room full of witnesses, simply because his arrogance convinced him we were too far beneath him to ever pose a threat. Spencer ran a hand through his expensive haircut, his own face starting to pale as the gravity of the situation sank in. How did this happen? Spencer demanded, keeping his voice low. Our lawyers assured us the injunction would be delayed. We had the district attorney in our pocket. We paid him. It is not the district attorney, Richard spat out, pacing again. It is the federal bench. The case got randomly reassigned this morning. Some new judge just took over the docket and bypassed all our roadblocks. She signed the freeze order and the search warrants before our legal team even knew what hit them. Spencer looked sick. Who is it? I do not know, Richard yelled, slamming his fist on the back of an empty chair. Our people are scrambling to find out her angle, but she is moving too fast. We have to purge the physical evidence before the FBI gets to the warehouse. My mother slowly reached out and grabbed my father's hand. They were both trembling. This was no longer just a bad dinner party. They were sitting in a room with men actively conspiring to commit federal felonies. If the authorities walked in right now, they could be implicated simply by association. Chloe, completely devoid of any situational awareness, tried to salvage her ruined night. Spencer, honey, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Maybe we should just finish the property transfer and go. We can deal with this tomorrow. Spencer turned on my sister with a look of pure hatred. It was the first time he had ever dropped the charming, wealthy fiancé act in front of her. Shut up, Chloe, he snapped viciously. Just shut your mouth. My family is about to lose hundreds of millions of dollars and you are whining about a house. Sit down and be quiet. Chloe recoiled as if she had been physically struck. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she did exactly as she was told. She shrank back into her chair, silent and submissive. The golden child completely stripped of her power, realizing in real time that her billionaire prince viewed her as nothing more than an annoying distraction. I watched the entire scene unfold with absolute clarity. The universe had just handed me the greatest gift imaginable. My family had brought me here to extort me. They had brought me here to strip me of my inheritance to fund their pathetic social climbing. But instead they had placed me in the exact right room at the exact right time to witness the complete unraveling of the Kensington Empire. I looked at my purse resting quietly on the chair next to me. Inside that purse was my smartphone. And thanks to a habit I had developed years ago when dealing with my toxic family, the voice memo recording app had been running silently since the moment Chloe threw the car keys at me in the lobby. Every threat, every insult, every extortion attempt, and now every single federal crime Richard and Spencer Kensington had just confessed to. It was all captured in pristine, high-definition audio. Richard finally stopped his frantic pacing and collapsed heavily into his chair at the head of the table. His chest was heaving under his expensive tailored suit. He reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed the bottle of $2,000 bourbon from the center of the table, and poured himself a massive measure. He did not bother to offer any to my father. He threw the liquid down his throat, grimacing as it hit his stomach, and slammed the heavy crystal glass back down onto the mahogany wood. Spencer leaned forward, his face pale and tense. "Dad, you still have not told me who signed the injunction." Spencer pressed his voice tight with anxiety. "We know everyone on the federal bench in this district. We have donated to their campaigns. We play golf with them. Who went rogue? Who is trying to freeze the accounts?" Richard let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a bark. "It is not one of the old guard," he snarled, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "It is the new appointment, the one the Senate just confirmed last month." Spencer looked confused. "The new appointment? I thought that seat was going to a corporate conservative." Richard slammed his fist on the armrest of his chair. "So did I. But the political winds shifted, and they needed a token to appease the masses. They gave the lifetime appointment to some 35-year-old black woman just to fill a diversity quota." The words hung in the air, incredibly ugly and laced with venom. Richard did not stop there. He leaned forward, his eyes wild with entitled rage. "What the hell does a woman like that know about international economic law? What does she know about offshore corporate structuring or hedge fund management? Absolutely nothing. They pulled some diversity hire out of a public defender's office, someone who probably spent her entire pathetic career defending street thugs, and handed her the keys to the federal judiciary. She thinks because she has a gavel she can play with the big boys. She is completely out of her depth." I sat at the end of the table, perfectly still, breathing evenly. The irony of the situation was so thick you could choke on it. The man was sitting 10 feet away from me, describing me with the most vile, racist, and sexist stereotypes imaginable, completely unaware that the very woman he was insulting was the only person in the room taking notes on his impending destruction. What sickened me more than Richard's blatant racism was the reaction of my own parents. Desmond, a black man who had faced discrimination his entire life, simply nodded his head in sympathetic agreement. "It is a real shame, Richard," my father said, his voice dropping to a low, comforting tone. "Standards have really fallen these days. You work hard your whole life to build a legitimate empire, and the government just hands authority over to people who have not earned it. People who just check a box on a diversity form. It is not fair to businessmen like you." My mother Valerie chimed in immediately, eager to prove her loyalty to the white billionaire. "Exactly," she agreed, glaring at me as if Richard's rant somehow validated her hatred of my career. "Some people just get handed prestigious titles because of how they look or where they come from. They have no real ambition or intelligence, not like our Chloe. Chloe knows how the real world works." I looked at my parents, genuinely marveling at the depths of their self-hatred. They were so desperate to sit at this table that they were actively validating the racism of a corrupt white man. They were throwing their own race, and implicitly me, completely under the bus, just to soothe the ego of a man who was actively shredding evidence to avoid federal prison. Chloe, sensing an opportunity to sound intelligent and supportive to her panicked fiancé, reached out and grabbed Spencer's hand. "Do not worry, babe," Chloe said confidently. She is probably just trying to make a name for herself by targeting a big company. If she is just a diversity hire, she will make a mistake. Your lawyers will tear her apart. Spencer did not even look at Chloe. He kept his eyes locked on his father. What is the strategy, Dad? If she has frozen the accounts, we cannot move the capital for the merger tomorrow. We are bleeding millions by the hour. Richard poured himself another drink, his face hardening into a mask of pure malice. The strategy is annihilation, Spencer. I am not going to let this little quota filler ruin my legacy. My legal team is already drafting an emergency motion. First thing Monday morning, I am walking into her courtroom with the most expensive, ruthless corporate litigators money can buy. We are going to bury her in paperwork. We are going to expose her lack of experience on the public record. I will humiliate her so badly, she will wish she never passed the bar exam. He took another aggressive swallow of his bourbon, pointing his glass toward the center of the room. I have destroyed politicians, judges, and lawmakers who thought they were untouchable. This little girl is nothing to me. By Friday, I will have her removed from the bench for judicial overreach. I will ruin her entire career. The sheer arrogance of his threats was astounding. He genuinely believed that his money made him a god. He believed that the justice system was just another commodity he could purchase, and that anyone who stood in his way could simply be crushed under the weight of his checkbook. My father raised his water glass in a pathetic gesture of solidarity. You show her, Richard. You show her how the real world operates. Spencer finally seemed to relax a fraction, comforted by his father's violent confidence. Good, Spencer said, running a hand over his face. Good. We will crush her on Monday. In the meantime, did Marcus confirm the warehouse servers are being wiped? Richard nodded slowly, a dark smile returning to his face. Marcus is handling it. By the time that stupid judge sends the FBI to look for the black fund ledgers, they will find nothing but ash and magnets. We are completely covered. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. The liquid felt cool and refreshing against my throat. I lowered my glass and looked at the men sitting around the table. They were so confident in their corruption. They had just conspired to destroy federal evidence admitted to massive financial fraud and openly threatened a sitting federal judge, all while a recording device sat silently in my purse, capturing every single undeniable word. I had come to this dinner expecting a tedious evening of emotional manipulation and petty insults. I had expected to defend my grandmother legacy against the greedy claws of my sister and my parents. I had not expected to be handed the final indisputable nail in the coffin of the Kensington corporate empire. The tension in the room began to shift again, having successfully convinced themselves that they were still untouchable. Richard and Spencer seemed to remember where they were. Richard adjusted his expensive silk tie and cleared his throat, transforming back into the composed patriarch. Well, Richard said, forcing a tight, patronizing smile as he looked at my father. I apologize for the interruption, Desmond. Business never sleeps, as they say. Now, where were we before that unpleasant phone call? Chloe, desperate to get the spotlight back onto her incoming wealth, immediately pointed a sharp acrylic nail at me. We were dealing with Simone, she snapped, her voice shrill and grating. She was just about to stop acting like a spoiled brat and sign the property transfer. My mother Valerie leaned forward, the vicious energy returning to her eyes now that the billionaire was watching her again. That is right. We have wasted enough time on this nonsense. Simone, you have sat here and listened to how important real business is. You have seen the kind of stress Richard and Spencer are under. The least you can do is stop being a burden to this family and sign the paper. I looked down at the torn pieces of the first contract resting near my plate, and then at the fresh, unblemished copy Chloe had pulled from her bag. They really thought nothing had changed. They really thought they could just pick up right where they left off, resuming their petty extortion, as if the men across the table were not heading straight for a federal penitentiary. Spencer crossed his arms, staring at me with a look of absolute disdain. He had just survived a moment of sheer panic, and he needed someone weaker to bully to regain his sense of superiority. Stop playing games, Simone, Spencer sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. You have milked this for all the attention you are going to get. Just sign the document. You do not understand these kinds of high-stakes transactions. You are just an admin. Leave the property management to people who actually know what to do with capital. The room grew very quiet. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for me to finally break. They were waiting for the obedient, beaten-down scapegoat to pick up the gold pen and surrender her dignity, her inheritance, and her future. I reached out and picked up the gold pen. Chloe let out a sharp breath of victory. My mother smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. But I did not move the pen toward the signature line. Instead, I held it loosely between my fingers, looking directly into Spencer Kensington's eyes. I did not lower the pen to the paper. Instead, I set it down gently on the smooth mahogany surface. The faint click echoed in the tense room. Chloe let out a loud groan of frustration, throwing her hands up in the air, but I kept my gaze locked entirely on Spencer. Before I sign over $1 million asset to your family, Spencer, I began, keeping my voice perfectly even and conversational. I think I have the right to ask a very practical question. My father immediately tried to intervene, his voice laced with panic. Simone, this is not the time for your questions. Just sign the document. I held up a single finger to silence him, never breaking eye contact with the billionaire heir sitting across from me. Your father just admitted that the FBI is currently raiding your corporate offices downtown, I said calmly. You are demanding my property to bolster your family assets for this marriage. But what happens if this new federal judge actually finds your hidden funds? If I give Chloe this house, will the government just seize it when your financial empire collapses under a federal indictment? Spencer scoffed loudly, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Collapses. Are you seriously giving me legal advice right now? It sounds like this judge has outsmarted you, I said, tilting my head slightly, feigning a mix of naive curiosity and subtle doubt. You are scrambling to shred documents in a basement. Are you absolutely sure you did not leave any financial paper trails? Because if the FBI traces the wire transfers, my grandmother's house goes down with your sinking ship. It was the perfect bait. I knew exactly how fragile the egos of men like Spencer and Richard Kensington were. They possessed a toxic, arrogant need to prove their supreme intelligence, especially to a black woman they considered to be nothing more than a lowly, uneducated administrative assistant. They could not stand the implication that they were vulnerable, let alone that they had been outmaneuvered. Richard let out a booming, patronizing laugh. He slammed his empty bourbon glass onto the table. Outsmarted us. Do not be ridiculous, Simone. You watch too many crime shows on television. The federal government is a slow, bloated machine, and that little diversity hire on the bench has absolutely no idea how global capital actually moves. Richard leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table, eager to flex his criminal genius to an audience. He wanted to put me in my place by demonstrating the sheer, untouchable scale of his power. There is no paper trail for them to find. Richard boasted, a smug grin spreading across his flushed face. The Black Fund is not sitting in a vault in New York. The shell companies are registered under dummy corporations in Georgetown down in the Cayman Islands. We use proxy directors who do not even know our names. The federal government has absolutely zero jurisdiction there. They cannot freeze what does not officially exist on American soil. I narrowed my eyes slightly, playing the part of the skeptic perfectly. But domestic wire transfers leave a digital footprint, I countered, keeping my tone perfectly innocent. The Securities and Exchange Commission tracks massive capital movements. A federal judge could easily subpoena the domestic bank managers who facilitated the transfers offshore. Spencer chuckled, shaking his head, as if he were dealing with a slow child. That is exactly why you do not understand real wealth, Simone. You think the system applies to everyone equally. You do not wait for a subpoena. You buy the bank manager before the audit even happens. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, arrogant pitch. We have the regional director of Sterling Trust Bank on a monthly retainer. $300,000 a year deposited directly into his wife's offshore trust account. He manually scrubs our domestic transfer logs every single quarter. By the time the regulators look at the bank records, the money we moved out of the country looks like a series of standard legitimate operational losses. I felt a thrill of cold satisfaction run through my veins. Bingo. Bribery of a financial institution officer. Wire fraud. International money laundering. Conspiracy to commit federal fraud. They were not just bragging, they were laying out the exact mechanics of their criminal enterprise, perfectly enunciating every felony for the microphone hidden in my purse. But what about the local authorities? I pressed, letting a touch of awe creep into my voice to feed their narcissism. Surely the district attorney would notice a discrepancy that large. Richard waved his hand dismissively. The district attorney is a politician, and politicians need campaign funds. We bought his loyalty 3 years ago. He is the one who usually buries these federal inquiries before they even reach a judge's desk. The only wild card in this entire equation is this rogue judge who took over the docket this morning. Richard poured himself another drink, his confidence completely restored by his own monologue. But she is a temporary annoyance, he continued. By Monday morning, I will have enough political pressure on her to force a recusal. We have 2 state senators on our payroll who can make her life a living hell in the press. We will claim she has a conflict of interest or manufacture a scandal about her background. She will be so busy defending her own reputation that she will beg to drop our case. My parents sat listening to this exchange with looks of absolute reverence. They were not horrified that their future in-laws were confessing to massive systematic corruption and the bribery of public officials. They were impressed. You see, Simone, my father Desmond said, puffing out his chest. This is how the real world operates. Richard and Spencer are always 10 steps ahead. They build empires because they know how to navigate the system. You could learn a lot from them instead of sitting there asking stupid questions. My mother Valerie nodded enthusiastically, turning her glare on me. Stop trying to find flaws in their business, Simone. They are billionaires. You are a clerk. You do not possess the intellectual capacity to understand their strategies. Just be grateful they are even allowing you to breathe the same air as them tonight. Chloe was practically swooning, staring at Spencer as if he were a superhero rather than a white-collar criminal. You are so brilliant, babe, she purred, reaching out to stroke his arm. That stupid judge has no idea who she is messing with. I looked around the table at the 5 of them. It was a perfect portrait of moral bankruptcy. The Kensingtons were corrupt to their very marrow, and my family was perfectly willing to sell their souls to share in the spoils. So the ledgers your man Marcus is shredding right now? I asked, wrapping up my interrogation with one final clarifying question. Those are just the physical backups. The actual digital footprint connecting you to the Cayman accounts is completely erased. Exactly, Spencer smirked, picking up his wineglass and taking a victorious sip. Burnt to a crisp, smashed with hammers and wiped with industrial magnets. The FBI is currently kicking down the doors of our downtown office just to find empty filing cabinets and blank hard drives. They have absolutely nothing on us. We are completely and totally untouchable. I smiled. It was not a polite smile or a fake socially acceptable smile. It was a real, genuine expression of absolute triumph. The voice memo app on my smartphone, safely tucked inside my emerald green designer clutch, resting on the chair beside me, was capturing every single syllable of this spectacular confession in crystal clear, high-definition audio. They had just handed me a sealed, airtight federal indictment on a silver platter. They had provided the exact names of their co-conspirators at the bank, the location of their offshore accounts, and the explicit details of their evidence destruction. I did not need the physical ledgers from their warehouse anymore. The audio recording of the CEO and the heir apparent openly admitting to the crimes was more than enough to secure a conviction that would put them both behind bars for decades. Spencer saw my smile and misinterpreted it entirely. He thought my smile meant I had finally accepted his superiority. He thought I was smiling in surrender. Glad to see you finally understand the reality of the situation, Simone, Spencer said, his tone dripping with arrogant satisfaction. Now that you know your little house is perfectly safe from the government, we can conclude this tedious family business. He tapped his index finger sharply against the fresh copy of the quitclaim deed sitting in front of me. "Stop wasting my time," Spencer ordered, his voice growing hard and impatient. "Pick up the pen, sign the document, and give your sister her house. We have a flight to Paris to catch tomorrow, and I am tired of looking at you." Chloe did not even wait for me to respond to Spencer. She slammed her open palm flat against the mahogany table, making the expensive silverware jump and the crystal wine glasses rattle. "Are you completely deaf, Simone?" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the private dining room. "The adult conversation is over. You had your little moment pretending to care about corporate finance, but let us be real. You do not understand these million-dollar numbers. You do not know how global capital works, and you never will. You are just a county clerk. Stop trying to sound smart and stop wasting the time of people who actually matter." My mother Valerie pushed her chair back and stood up, looming over the table. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "I am absolutely sick of looking at your stubborn, ungrateful face," Valerie hissed, her eyes blazing with a toxic fury that stripped away any remaining illusion of maternal love. "We have bent over backward to include you tonight. We let you sit at this table with billionaires. And this is how you repay us. By asking stupid questions and delaying your sister's future." My father Desmond nodded vigorously, his face set in a hard, unforgiving line. "Listen to me very carefully, Simone. If you do not pick up that pen and sign your name right now, you can consider yourself an orphan. I will erase your name from our family tree. I will tell the extended family that you are dead to us. You will not be welcome at Thanksgiving. You will not be welcome at Christmas. You will be entirely cut off, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life alone." The room grew incredibly tense. They were unleashing their ultimate weapon, the threat of total excommunication. For most people, the idea of being permanently discarded by their own parents would be a devastating blow. It was the emotional nuclear option. Valerie and Desmond were banking on the fact that my fear of abandonment would finally crush my resistance. They thought I would crumble, cry, and desperately sign away my million-dollar inheritance just to buy back their conditional toxic affection. But they were fundamentally wrong. I sat there absorbing their venom, and for the first time in my 35 years of life, I did not feel a single ounce of pain. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection or the desperate childhood urge to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. The biological bond that tied me to these people withered and died right there in the Kensington Country Club. I looked at my mother, a woman who was willing to destroy her eldest daughter to appease a corrupt white billionaire. I looked at my father, a man who would rather disown his own flesh and blood than stand up for what was right. They were not my family. They were just my bullies. And I was finally free. Spencer, clearly enjoying the pathetic spectacle of my family tearing me apart for his benefit, checked his heavy gold Rolex watch. "I am losing my patience, Simone," he said coldly. "You have exactly 10 seconds to sign that deed, or I am having club security throw you out. I am not going to sit here and watch you disrespect your parents any longer." Richard Kensington let out a deep sigh of extreme boredom. "Just sign the damn paper, girl. Do not make a scene in my club. You people always have to make everything so difficult. You people." The racial slur was barely disguised, wrapped in the casual arrogance of a man who believed he owned the world. My parents heard it, and they said absolutely nothing. They just stared at me, their eyes wide with manic expectation, waiting for me to submit to their masters. Chloe shoved the manila envelope closer to me, the paper scraping loudly against the polished wood. "Sign it, Simone. Right now. You are holding up the wedding preparations. I need that property transferred by tomorrow morning so Spencer and I can finalize the Hamptons estate purchase before we fly to Paris. You are ruining my perfect night." The sheer level of delusion in the room was suffocating. Chloe was worried about a flight to Paris, completely ignorant of the fact that Spencer would likely have his passport confiscated by federal agents before the weekend was over. Richard was worried about a minor property dispute, completely unaware that his entire corporate empire was currently being dismantled by the Department of Justice. and my parents were worried about securing their spot in high society, completely blind to the fact that they were chaining themselves to a sinking ship. They were all demanding that I surrender my grandmother's legacy to fund a criminal enterprise that was hours away from public annihilation. My mother took a step closer, her hands curled into tight fists. Do not test us, Simone. I mean it. I will call every aunt, every uncle, and every cousin we have and tell them how you tried to extort your own sister on the eve of her wedding. You will be a pariah. No one in our community will ever speak to you again. You would really do that? I asked, my voice perfectly calm, barely above a whisper. You would throw away your own daughter for a house. You threw yourself away the moment you decided to be a difficult, bitter spinster. Valerie spat back, her face twisting with ugly resentment. Chloe is the future of this family. You are just an obstacle. Now remove the obstacle and sign the paper. I looked at my father. Desmond, is this what you want? You are willing to let Grandmother Estelle's house go to people who openly mock you. Do not bring your grandmother into this. Desmond roared, his face flushing with embarrassment. She would be ashamed of you. Now do as you are told. The betrayal was absolute. The gaslighting had reached its absolute peak. They had isolated me, threatened me, insulted my intelligence, and tried to strip me of everything I owned. I looked down at the gold pen resting on the table next to the fraudulent quitclaim deed. It was a beautiful pen, heavy, expensive, and completely useless for what they wanted me to do. I did not reach for it. I did not move. 10 seconds are up. Spencer snapped, his face darkening with genuine anger. He slapped his hand hard on the table. Are you stupid or just deaf? I told you to sign the document. I slowly lifted my gaze from the table and looked directly into Spencer Kensington's eyes. The air in the room suddenly grew freezing cold. The quiet, submissive sister they thought they had invited to dinner was gone. The frightened daughter my parents thought they could manipulate was gone. I reached out, but I did not reach for the pen. I reached for my crystal water glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch out until it became physically uncomfortable for everyone in the room. Then I set the glass down and prepared to deliver the final blow. I placed the crystal glass back onto the mahogany surface. The faint clink was the only sound in the room for a fleeting second. I looked at the pristine quitclaim deed resting near my plate, then extended my index finger and pushed it back across the table toward Chloe. I am not signing this, I stated. My voice was no longer conversational. It carried the heavy, resonant authority I usually reserved for the bench. The structural integrity of this contract is an absolute joke, and more importantly, I do not tolerate corruption, nor do I willingly hand over my assets to confessed criminals. The word criminals dropped into the center of the dining room like a live grenade. For a moment, the sheer audacity of my statement seemed to short-circuit their brains. My mother, Valerie, let out a high-pitched gasp, covering her mouth with both hands as if she had just witnessed a murder. My father, Desmond, physically recoiled in his chair, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. He quickly looked over at Richard Kensington, terrified that the billionaire would instantly order our entire family to be executed on the spot. Chloe's face drained of all color. She looked at the contract, then at me, her mind struggling to comprehend that her master plan had just been entirely derailed by the sister she considered to be a weak, spineless pushover. But it was Spencer who reacted with the most violence. The charming, wealthy heir persona shattered completely. Spencer pushed his heavy wooden dining chair back with such vicious force that it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor behind him. He stood up, leaning his entire body weight over the mahogany table, his face twisting into a mask of pure white-hot rage. The veins in his neck stood out and his skin flushed an angry mottled red. "What did you just call us?" Spencer demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous and guttural pitch. I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I maintained direct eye contact with him. I believe I used the term confessed criminals. I replied smoothly, folding my hands neatly in my lap. Though technically, given the detailed conversation you and your father just had regarding money laundering, the bribery of a bank official, and the deliberate destruction of federal evidence felons, would be the more accurate legal terminology. Richard Kensington slammed his fist onto the table, his heavy gold rings loudly striking the wood. "How dare you speak to us that way in my club?" Richard roared, his chest heaving. "Desmond, get your psychotic daughter under control before I have security drag her out of here by her hair." Desmond panicked. He jumped to his feet, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender toward the billionaires. "Richard, please, I am so sorry," my father pleaded, his voice cracking with humiliation. "She does not know what she is saying. She is just a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin her sister's night. Please do not let this affect the wedding. We will make her sign the deed. I promise you we will force her to sign it." Valerie turned to me, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. "Apologize to them right now, Simone," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Get on your knees and apologize to Mr. Kensington. You are destroying everything we have worked for. You are a monster." I looked at my parents, feeling a cold wave of finality wash over me. Even now, after hearing these men confess to federal crimes, after hearing a white billionaire threaten to have their daughter dragged out by her hair, their only instinct was to beg for his forgiveness. They were beyond saving. They were entirely hollowed out by their obsession with status. I ignored my parents completely and kept my eyes fixed on Spencer. Spencer let out a harsh, barking laugh, though there was absolutely no humor in his eyes. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You sit there acting like you have some kind of moral high ground," Spencer sneered, his upper lip curling in disgust. "You think because you learned a few legal buzzwords you can sit at my table and accuse my family of crimes? You are nothing, Simone. You are a nobody." He began to pace slightly, the adrenaline of his anger making it impossible for him to stand still. "What the hell do you know about the law anyway?" he shouted, gesturing wildly. "You are a glorified secretary. You spend your pathetic, meaningless days sitting in a depressing municipal building, fetching coffee for people who actually matter. You are an admin, a paper pusher, a human filing cabinet." Spencer placed both of his hands flat on the table, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive red wine on his breath. The sheer arrogance radiating from him was suffocating. He genuinely believed that his wealth made him a superior species of human, and that anyone who worked for a living was entirely beneath his contempt. "The Kensingtons employ teams of lawyers who went to Harvard and Yale." Spencer continued, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "We employ men who write the very laws you file away in your little folders. We control the capital that keeps this city running. We are untouchable. And you have the absolute audacity to sit here, drink my wine, and try to lecture me about how the world works." Chloe, emboldened by Spencer's aggressive rant, found her voice again. "She is just trying to sound important, Spencer," Chloe sneered, glaring at me with pure hatred. "She has always done this. She reads a few legal documents at her little desk job and suddenly she thinks she is the Chief Justice. It is pathetic. She is just trying to distract us from the fact that she is too selfish to give up that house." Spencer did not even look at Chloe. His eyes were locked onto mine, burning with a desperate need to crush my spirit and reassert his dominance. He needed me to cower. He needed me to look away and apologize to validate his belief that he was an untouchable king, and I was just a peasant who had spoken out of turn. But I remained perfectly still. My posture was straight, my expression composed, my breathing steady. The contrast between his unhinged, screaming rage and my absolute freezing calm only infuriated him more. He was losing control of the narrative, and it was driving him insane. "Who do you think you are?" Spencer demanded, his voice cracking slightly with the force of his anger. "What gives you the right to judge us? You have achieved absolutely nothing in your miserable 35 years of life. Your own parents are sitting right here telling you that you are a failure. You do not have a husband, you do not have a real career, and you do not have a future. You are just a bitter, lonely woman clinging to an old house because it is the only thing of value you will ever possess." He stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest, looking down at me with the ultimate expression of arrogant superiority. He was ready to deliver his final crushing blow. He wanted to humiliate me in front of my family, to strip away whatever tiny shred of dignity he thought I was clinging to. "Tell me," Simone Spencer mocked, his voice echoing loudly in the silent, tense room. "Since you are suddenly an expert on the federal justice system, let us hear it. Let us hear all about your grand important career. What exactly do you do at that courthouse all day?" He let out a short, cruel laugh, looking around the table to ensure he had an audience for his punchline. "Do you sort the mail? Do you validate parking for the real lawyers? Do you alphabetize the parking tickets? Tell me, what is your pathetic little job title that makes you think you have the authority to look down on the Kensington family?" The entire room held its breath. My father was staring at the floor in shame. My mother was glaring at me, waiting for me to be publicly destroyed. Chloe was smirking, eager to hear me admit my own insignificance. Richard Kensington was swirling his bourbon, watching me with mild amusement, waiting for the peasant to finally bow her head. They all wanted an answer. They all wanted to know exactly what I did at the courthouse. I looked at Spencer Kensington, a man who had just handed me his entire criminal enterprise on a silver platter, and I prepared to give him exactly what he asked for. I pushed my chair back slowly, the wooden legs gliding silently over the expensive Persian rug. I stood up, taking my time to smooth down the front of my emerald green silk dress. I did not rush. When you hold absolute power, you never have to rush. I let the silence in the room stretch until it became heavy and suffocating. I looked down at Spencer, whose chest was heaving with arrogant exertion, and then I slowly shifted my gaze to his father Richard, who was watching me with narrow, impatient eyes. Spencer scoffed, throwing his hands up in a gesture of exaggerated exasperation. "Well, are you going to answer me, or are you just going to stand there like an idiot? What is your job, Simone?" I kept my eyes locked on his. "Judge," I said. Just one word. It left my lips softly, but it struck the center of the mahogany table like a physical blow. Spencer blinked. The cruel smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He looked at Chloe, then back at me. "Judge, what does that mean? Like traffic court? Do you process parking disputes?" My mother Valerie let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, desperate to break the tension. "Do not be ridiculous, Simone. Stop lying to these people. You are an administrative assistant. Tell them the truth." I did not break eye contact with Spencer. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my leather credentials wallet. I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the weight of years of grueling work, late nights, and the countless barriers I had shattered to earn what was inside. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I tossed it onto the table. It landed right next to the fraudulent quitclaim deed, flipping open upon impact. The heavy gold seal of the United States federal government caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above. The bold embossed lettering next to my official portrait read, clear as day, Federal District Judge. The room went completely dead. It was not just quiet. It was a total vacuum of sound, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the VIP dining suite. "I am a federal district court judge." I enunciated, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "I am the youngest African-American woman to be appointed to the bench in this circuit. The United States Senate confirmed my appointment last month, and as of 9 o'clock this morning, I am the presiding judge over the Department of Justice investigation into the Kensington Corporation." I turned my eyes directly to Richard Kensington. The billionaire patriarch was sitting frozen in his chair, his hand hovering inches away from his bourbon glass. "I am the quota filler, Richard," I said, throwing his exact words back into his face. "I am the little diversity hire from the public defender office who has absolutely no idea how global capital moves. I am the rogue judge who signed the search warrants, authorized the FBI raids on your downtown offices, and froze your Cayman Island shell accounts before your legal team even knew what hit them." The color drained from Richard Kensington's face so fast, I thought he was going to have a heart attack right there at the table. His flushed, angry complexion turned a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack. He stared at the gold badge resting on the mahogany table as if it were a venomous snake coiled to strike. Spencer physically stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly before he hit the wall behind him. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable heir, who had just thrown $100 bill at me like a beggar, was now hyperventilating, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. I looked at my sister. Chloe was sitting completely rigid. Her perfectly flat ironed hair and heavily beaded designer gown suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Her brain was violently short-circuiting as she tried to process the reality in front of her. The sister she had spent her entire life looking down upon, the sister she had just demanded become. Her valet was one of the most powerful legal figures in the state. "No," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "No, that is not possible. You file paperwork. Mom and Dad said you just file paperwork." "I file injunctions," Chloe, I replied coldly. "I file arrest warrants. I file federal indictments against corrupt corporations. But you and our parents were so thoroughly obsessed with yourselves and your desperate social climbing that you never bothered to actually ask me what I do. You just assumed I was beneath you." My father, Desmond, let out a sound that was half gasp and half whimper. He looked at the federal badge, then up at me, his eyes filled with a horrific realization. He had just spent the last hour threatening to disown a sitting federal judge in front of two men who were currently under federal investigation. Simone. My mother. Valerie choked out, her voice barely a squeak. "Simone, please tell me this is a joke. Tell me you bought that badge online." "I am afraid it is very real, Valerie," I said, addressing her by her first name. "And it makes the conversation you all just had incredibly problematic." I reached back into my clutch and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen once, bringing up the voice memo app. The bright red recording timer was still ticking upwards, currently sitting at 1 hour and 12 minutes. Richard Kensington let out a strangled gasp, finally finding his voice. "You recorded us," he wheezed, clutching his chest. I smiled, holding the phone up for everyone to see. "You invited me to a private room, surrounded me with hostile individuals, and attempted to legally extort $1 million property from me under extreme duress. Recording the interaction for my own protection was simply a basic legal precaution. But I must admit, I did not expect you to be so generous." I tapped the screen, rewinding the audio file a few minutes back, and pressed play. Richard's voice, loud and boastful, echoed from the phone speaker. "The Black Fund is not sitting in a vault in New York. The shell companies are registered under dummy corporations in Georgetown, down in the Cayman Islands. We use proxy directors. We have the regional director of Sterling Trust Bank on a monthly retainer." I paused the recording. The silence that followed was heavy with the crushing weight of their impending doom. "You openly confessed to international money laundering, bribery of a financial officer, and conspiracy to commit fraud." I listed off the charges methodically. "And just to ensure the Department of Justice has an airtight case against you, you also confessed to violating Title 18, Section 1519. You literally screamed an order to shred ledgers and wipe hard drives to obstruct a federal investigation." Spencer looked like he was going to vomit. He looked at his father, his eyes pleading for a solution, but Richard was completely broken. The billionaire titan of industry was slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the table, realizing that his own monumental arrogance had just handed him a 20-year prison sentence. "You entrapped us," Spencer yelled, his voice cracking hysterically. "This is illegal. You cannot use that recording. We did not consent. We are in a one-party consent state, Spencer." I corrected him smoothly, enjoying the absolute panic in his eyes. "Furthermore, there is no expectation of privacy when you are shouting your criminal conspiracies across a dining table in front of 5 different witnesses. This recording is perfectly admissible in federal court." I turned my gaze back to my parents. Valerie and Desmond were clutching each other, trembling violently. Their grand plan to join high society had just collapsed into a spectacular radioactive disaster. "And as for you two," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy tone, "you just sat here and actively aided these men in an attempt to coerce a federal judge into signing over a high-value asset. You threatened me with financial and social ruin if I did not comply. That is called extortion. You are essentially unindicted co-conspirators at this point. My father dropped his head into his hands, sobbing openly. We did not know, Desmond cried, his tears splashing onto the fine china. We swear, Simone, we did not know who you were. That is exactly the point, Desmond, I replied. You never knew who I was, and now you never will. I picked up my leather credentials wallet, snapping it shut, and slipped it back into my purse along with my phone. The balance of power in the room had shifted so violently that the atmosphere felt entirely different. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey caught in a trap of their own making, waiting for the gavel to drop. The air in the VIP suite was thick enough to choke on. The luxurious atmosphere of the Kensington Country Club, with its crystal chandeliers and imported mahogany paneling, suddenly felt like the walls of a very expensive prison cell. I stood at the end of the table, entirely composed, while the people who had spent the last 2 hours trying to destroy me began to mentally disintegrate. Richard Kensington, the man who had just boasted about controlling the city and destroying politicians, looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His jaw literally hung open. All the blood had vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His hands, which had previously been adorned with heavy gold rings that he used to bang on the table for emphasis, were now trembling violently in his lap. He could not even bring himself to look at the gold badge resting on the table. He was staring blankly at his own hands, the reality of a federal penitentiary cell closing in around him. The titan of industry had been reduced to a terrified old man in the span of 60 seconds. Spencer was faring even worse. The confident, sneering air had been completely shattered. He backed away from the table, his eyes darting frantically around the room, as if looking for an escape route that did not exist. His expensive Italian leather shoes caught the leg of the overturned dining chair, and he practically fell over it, catching himself awkwardly against the wall. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic stuttering sound came out. I did not. We were just talking, he stammered, completely abandoning his father and his own arrogant bravado. He looked physically ill. Then there was Chloe. My sister, the golden child, simply could not process the data her eyes and ears were receiving. Her entire worldview was built on the fundamental belief that she was superior to me in every conceivable way. To accept that I was a federal judge holding the fate of her billionaire fiancé in my hands would mean accepting that her entire life, her entire identity, was a fragile lie. She forced a smile. It was a grotesque, trembling thing that did not reach her eyes. You are tricking everyone, right? Chloe asked, her voice shaking so badly she could barely get the words out. This is a prank. You paid someone to make that badge. You are just an admin, Simone. You file papers. Mom and Dad said so. I looked at my sister, feeling a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I let a cold smirk touch my lips. That is because this family never bothered to ask what my actual position was for the past 5 years. I replied, my words slicing through her delusion like a surgical blade. You never asked about my law degree. You never attended my graduation. You never asked how I afforded my own properties, or why I worked such long hours. You only like to hear what you want to believe. I turned my gaze to my parents. Valerie was clutching the edge of the table, her knuckles pure white, her mouth opening and closing silently. Desmond was staring at me with a look of absolute horror, finally realizing the magnitude of the catastrophic mistake he had made. You needed me to be a failure, so you could feel like a success. I continued, my voice echoing in the silent room. So when I said I worked at the federal courthouse, your own prejudice filled in the blanks. You built a narrative that suited your vanity. You told your friends I was a struggling clerk because it made Chloe's social climbing look that much more impressive by comparison. You actively chose to be ignorant. And your ignorance just cost you absolutely everything. I gestured toward the fraudulent quitclaim deed still sitting on the table, ripped in half. You brought me here to steal my inheritance to impress a family of criminals. You thought you were sacrificing a pawn to protect your queen, but you did not realize you were playing against the house. Spencer, desperate and backed into a corner, tried to pivot. He pushed himself off the wall and took a hesitant step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. The condescending tone was entirely gone, replaced by the whining pitch of a desperate coward. Simone. Your Honor. Spencer choked out, forcing the title past his lips. Let us be reasonable. There is no need to destroy our families over a misunderstanding. We can make this right. You do not need to submit that recording to the authorities. We will compensate you. We will drop the demand for the house. We will give you whatever you want. Name your price. I stared at him, my expression turning to pure ice. Do not insult my intelligence, Spencer. You just offered a sitting federal judge a bribe to suppress evidence of a federal crime while being recorded committing another federal crime. Your sense of entitlement is truly a terminal disease. Richard finally found a fraction of his voice. He leaned heavily on the table, looking at my parents with wild, accusing eyes. You set us up, Richard hissed, spit flying from his lips. You brought a federal informant to my dinner table. You plotted this to steal our money. Desmond shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. No, Richard, I swear to God we did not know. We thought she was just a secretary. We would never betray you. Please, you have to believe us. It was a pathetic display. My father was literally begging for the mercy of a man who was about to lose everything, prioritizing his social standing over the daughter who had just outsmarted them all. The Kensington Empire was collapsing in real time, and my parents were still trying to cling to the wreckage. I am not an informant, Richard, I said, drawing his furious attention back to me. I am the presiding judge over your criminal indictment, and I assure you, I had no idea you were going to be stupid enough to openly confess your entire money laundering operation over a plate of Wagyu beef. You dug your own grave. I just happened to be sitting here holding the shovel. Chloe burst into heavy, hysterical sobs. She looked at Spencer, reaching out a trembling hand toward him. Spencer, do something, she cried. Tell her she cannot do this. We are getting married. We are going to Paris tomorrow. Spencer looked at her as if she were a rotting piece of garbage. He slapped her hand away with such force that she stumbled back against her chair. Are you insane? Spencer screamed at her, his face contorting with panic and fury. There is no wedding. There is no Paris. My father and I are facing decades in a federal penitentiary because you invited your psychotic sister to our private dinner. Get away from me. Chloe let out a devastated wail, collapsing into her seat and burying her face in her hands. The golden child, the perfect daughter, the future billionaire wife was completely and utterly destroyed. Her fairy tale had shattered into a million jagged pieces, and the man she had traded her soul for had just discarded her like trash. My mother Valerie rushed to Chloe's side, wrapping her arms around her weeping daughter. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a terror she could no longer hide. What do you want? Simone Valerie whispered, her voice cracking. You have ruined us. You have ruined your sister's life. Are you happy now? I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing. I did not ruin anything, Valerie. I simply allowed all of you to face the consequences of your own actions. You wanted the truth. Now you have to live with it. Richard Kensington was a man who had spent his entire life buying his way out of consequences. When intimidation failed, his instinct immediately shifted to the only other language he knew: money. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with his silk napkin and took a shaky breath, attempting to reconstruct his shattered composure. Listen to me, Simone. Richard began, his voice taking on a desperate negotiating tone. We are all reasonable adults here. You are a smart woman. You did not get to your position by acting purely on emotion. Let us look at this pragmatically. He leaned forward, keeping his voice low, as if we were discussing a corporate merger instead of multiple federal felonies. You caught us off guard. I will admit that. You played a brilliant hand. But submitting that recording benefits no one. It will drag your sister and your parents through a grueling public trial. It will cause a media circus that could easily derail your own career. You know how Washington works. They do not like judges who create messy scandals. I kept my face entirely impassive, letting him dig his grave deeper. I can make this all go away for you, Richard continued, mistaking my silence for consideration. You do not want that old house. You want real financial security. I can wire $5 million into an offshore account of your choosing by tomorrow morning. Clean money. Untraceable. I will buy you a penthouse overlooking the city. I will set up a trust fund that guarantees you will never have to work another day in your life. Just delete that file. Hand over the phone and we walk out of this room as allies. Spencer, catching on to his father's strategy, nodded frantically. Yes. Yes, we can do that. Whatever you want, Simone. 10 million. Just name your price. We have the liquidity. We can make you richer than you ever imagined. My father Desmond perked up, the greed temporarily overriding his terror. Simone, listen to them. $10 million. You could be set for life. Do not throw this opportunity away just to prove a point. Take the deal. I looked at the three of them. A corrupt billionaire, his cowardly heir, and my own pathetic father, all eagerly participating in the attempted bribery of a federal officer. It was a stunning display of moral decay. They truly believed that integrity was just a price tag waiting to be met. I slowly lifted my right hand. I was still holding my smartphone. The screen was still illuminated, and the red recording icon was still pulsing steadily. I want to thank both of you, I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. Thank you for the voluntary explicit confession regarding your money laundering operations, your destruction of evidence, and your bribery of a bank official. And thank you, Richard, for capping off the evening by offering a $10 million bribe to a sitting federal judge in exchange for suppressing evidence. That is a violation of Title 18, Section 201. You just added another 15 years to your potential sentence. Richard stared at the glowing screen of my phone, his eyes widening in absolute horror, as he realized I had never stopped recording. He had just confessed to a brand new felony on tape. You stupid girl. Richard spat, his negotiation tactic instantly reverting to pure venom. You cannot preside over this case anymore. You are deeply compromised. We have personal ties. Chloe is engaged to my son. You were at my private dinner. It is a massive conflict of interest. Any ruling you make will be thrown out on appeal. The moment my lawyers bring this up, the Judicial Ethics Committee will strip you of your robe. He was grasping at straws, trying to use the legal system he so openly despised as a shield. You are absolutely right, Richard, I replied with a calm, predatory smile. The sudden agreement caught him off guard. Spencer looked up, a tiny, desperate glimmer of hope sparking in his eyes. As a federal judge, I am bound by a strict code of ethics, I explained, delivering the words with methodical precision. I cannot preside over a case involving individuals with whom I have personal or familial ties. It is a textbook conflict of interest. If I retained this case, your lawyers would indeed have grounds for an appeal. Chloe lifted her head from her hands, her tear-streaked face looking toward me. Does that mean you are dropping it? She whispered, desperate for a miracle. I looked at my sister, feeling no sympathy. It means, Chloe, that first thing Monday morning, I am formally recusing myself from the Kensington Corporation fraud case. I will step down as the presiding judge. Richard let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He slumped back into his chair, wiping his face with both hands. He thought he had found the loophole. He thought his threat to my career had forced my hand. Spencer let out a shaky laugh, burying his face in his hands. But my smile did not fade. It only grew sharper. However, I continued, my voice cutting through their momentary relief like a scythe. Recusing myself from presiding over the trial does not erase my obligations as an officer of the court. When a federal judge is presented with incontrovertible evidence of ongoing systemic felonies, we do not just walk away. Richard froze. The relief vanished from his face, replaced by a new creeping dread. While you were busy screaming at your fixer to shred those ledgers, I tapped a few buttons on my screen, I said, holding the phone up slightly higher. The voice memo file containing your entire confession is no longer just on this device. It was automatically synced to my secure cloud server the moment I paused the playback. I looked directly into Richard's eyes, watching the last remaining spark of hope die within them. And 10 minutes ago, while you were all screaming at me to sign that worthless quitclaim deed, I forwarded that secure link directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with a formal judicial recommendation to immediately expand the scope of their search warrants to include your Cayman Islands shell accounts and your contacts at Sterling Trust Bank. The silence that hit the room this time was absolute. It was the silence of a grave being filled. By the time you wake up tomorrow morning, Richard, you will not be dealing with a single judge you can try to bully or bribe. You will be dealing with the full, unmitigated weight of the United States Department of Justice. They have your voice. They have your son's voice. They have the names of your accomplices. Spencer let out a sound like a wounded animal. He grabbed his own hair, pulling it hard, his chest heaving with panic attacks. No, 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 this cannot be happening. We are ruined. Dad, we are completely ruined. Richard did not move. He did not speak. He just stared straight ahead at the mahogany paneling of his exclusive restricted country club, trapped in a nightmare from which he could never buy his way out. He had built an empire on intimidation, corruption, and the belief that the rules did not apply to him. And it had all been dismantled by the one woman he had dismissed as completely insignificant. I turned my attention to my parents. They were huddled together on the opposite side of the table, looking like two frightened children who had just watched their house burn down. As for you, I said, addressing Valerie and Desmond, you wanted a front row seat to high society. You wanted to see how the real world operates. Well, you are looking at it. This is your legacy. You attached yourselves to criminals, and you were perfectly willing to sell your own daughter to keep them happy. Valerie began to weep uncontrollably, burying her face in Desmond's shoulder. Desmond just stared at the floor, completely broken. I slipped my phone back into my designer clutch and snapped it shut with a definitive echoing click. The sound signaled the absolute end of the confrontation. The checkmate was complete. There were no more moves to make, no more bribes to offer, and no more threats to levy. The Kensington dynasty was dead, and my toxic family had destroyed their own future in their desperate attempt to steal mine. The silence in the room was violently shattered by Spencer Kensington. The crushing reality of his impending federal indictment finally broke whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. He spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot, and locked his gaze onto Chloe. The woman he had been parading around as his beautiful bride just an hour ago was now the singular target of his unhinged, desperate fury. "You stupid, worthless gold digger!" Spencer screamed, his voice cracking with panic. Before anyone could react, he lunged forward. He raised his hand and struck Chloe viciously across the face. The sharp, sickening crack of his palm hitting her cheek echoed off the mahogany walls like a gunshot. Chloe screamed, the force of the blow knocking her completely out of her chair. She crashed onto the expensive Persian rug, her heavy designer gown tangling around her legs. She curled into a ball, clutching her rapidly bruising face, sobbing hysterically as she looked up at the man she thought was her ticket to a billionaire lifestyle. "You brought the Grim Reaper to my dinner table," Spencer roared, standing over her, his fists clenched at his sides. "You just had to show off. You just had to invite your psychotic sister to prove you were better than her. You brought a federal judge into a room with my father. You ruined my family. You ruined my entire life." Richard Kensington did not even flinch at the violence. He remained slumped in his chair, staring blankly ahead, entirely paralyzed by his own ruin. "Get out of my sight," Spencer spat, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "The engagement is over. The wedding is cancelled. If I ever see your pathetic face again, I will destroy whatever is left of you. You and your trash family are dead to me." My mother Valerie let out a blood-curdling shriek, but she did not rush to the floor to hold her bleeding, discarded daughter. She did not turn her anger toward the man who had just assaulted her child. Instead, the absolute sickness of my parents' social climbing obsession was laid bare for the final time. Valerie and Desmond turned their frantic, tear-streaked faces toward me. They practically crawled across the room, their hands outstretched, begging. "Simone, please," my mother wailed, her voice thick with desperation. Look at what you are doing. You are destroying your sister's life. Spencer is leaving her. She will have nothing. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Just delete the recording. Delete the file and tell the FBI it was a mistake. We will do anything you want. My father grabbed the edge of the dining table to support his shaking frame. Simone, you have to save this marriage, Desmond cried, completely abandoning any shred of dignity he had left. Spencer is just upset. He did not mean to hit her. If you drop the case, he will take her back. We can still be part of this family. Do not let your jealousy ruin Chloe's one chance at happiness. I looked down at the two people who had brought me into this world. I observed them with the cold clinical detachment of a judge examining a deeply flawed piece of evidence. A 36-year-old man just struck your youngest daughter to the ground in a fit of rage, I said, my voice cutting through their pathetic weeping with absolute freezing clarity. And instead of protecting her, instead of calling the police, your first instinct is to beg me to protect his bank account so she can still marry her abuser. Valerie choked on a sob, looking away from my piercing gaze. For 35 years, I was the scapegoat of this family. I continued letting every word fall like a hammer. You despised me because I refused to straighten my hair, lighten my skin, or bow down to the white wealth you so desperately worship. You groomed Chloe to be a shiny object for rich men, and you conditioned yourselves to believe that her proximity to their money somehow made you important. I gestured toward the chaotic scene in front of me. Spencer pacing like a trapped rat, Richard staring into the void, and Chloe weeping alone on the floor. Well, look at your importance now, I said softly. Look at the men you told me to bow down to. They are not titans of industry. They are terrified, cowardly criminals who turn on each other the second they lose control. And you are so spiritually bankrupt that you are still trying to sell your daughter to them. You did not just break my heart tonight, you proved that you never had one to begin with. I turned away from my parents, ignoring their continued pathetic pleas. I walked calmly back to my place at the table. The pristine, unblemished copy of the quitclaim deed that Chloe had pulled from her bag was still sitting there waiting for my signature. I picked up the heavy legal document. Spencer stopped his frantic pacing and watched me, a flicker of crazed confusion crossing his face. Chloe slowly lowered her hands from her bruised cheek, watching me from the floor. You wanted this house so badly? I said, addressing my family one last time. You were willing to disown me, extort me, and humiliate me just to secure this property for a dowry. You thought I was clinging to it because I was a bitter, lonely woman. I gripped the top of the document with both hands. But you made a critical error in your due diligence, I stated. You assumed I still owned it. With a swift, decisive motion, I tore the thick stack of legal papers squarely in half. Then I put the halves together and tore them again. I opened my hands, letting the shredded pieces of the fraudulent contract flutter down onto the mahogany table and the Persian rug falling like dirty snow over the remnants of their ruined dinner. Grandmother Estelle knew exactly what you would try to do, I explained, watching the realization slowly dawn on their horrified faces. She knew you would try to bleed me dry to fund your delusions. That is why I took action over a year ago. I do not own the historic brownstone anymore. I transferred the total ownership of the property, including the deed and all associated equity, into an irrevocable trust. Valerie stopped crying. Her mouth fell open. An irrevocable trust, she repeated weakly. Yes, I smiled, feeling the ultimate weight of my victory. It is now the primary headquarters for the Estelle Foundation, a fully funded legal aid clinic dedicated entirely to providing free representation for marginalized women of color facing domestic abuse and financial extortion. The house is a registered charitable entity. It cannot be sold, it cannot be transferred, and it certainly cannot be used as a dowry for a white-collar criminal. I looked down at Chloe, who was staring at the torn pieces of paper on the floor, as if her entire world had just ceased to exist. Even if you had successfully bullied me into signing that paper tonight, I said gently, it would have been completely legally void. You spent this entire evening fighting over a ghost. You sold your souls for absolutely nothing. You are walking away from this table with empty hands. I reached into my emerald green designer clutch one final time. I bypassed my phone and my judicial credentials, sliding my fingers over the crisp paper resting at the very bottom. I pulled out the folded $100 bill that Spencer Kensington had arrogantly shoved at me when I arrived at the club. I walked over to where Spencer was standing. He shrank back slightly, his previous bravado entirely erased by the terrifying reality of my authority. I held the $100 bill out between my index and middle finger. Then with a flick of my wrist, I threw it directly at his chest. The bill hit his expensive tailored jacket and fluttered to the floor, landing near the toe of his Italian leather shoe. "Keep your tip, Spencer," I said, my voice echoing with finality. "You are going to need every dollar you can get for your prison commissary account." I did not wait for his response. I did not look back at my weeping mother, my broken father, or my shattered sister. I simply turned on my heel, the silk of my dress catching the light of the crystal chandeliers, and walked out of the VIP dining room. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind me, sealing them inside the tomb of their own making. The crisp night air hit my face as I exited the Kensington Country Club. I handed my ticket to the valet, who promptly brought around my modest sedan. As I drove away from the sprawling estate, watching the manicured hedges fade into the rearview mirror, I felt a profound sense of peace. The heavy, suffocating chain that had bound me to my toxic family for 35 years was finally broken. I was entirely free. The weekend passed in a blur of swift, decisive action. By Sunday evening, the news networks were flooded with breaking reports. The FBI had conducted synchronized raids on the Kensington Corporation headquarters, seizing servers, freezing international assets, and arresting multiple executives. Richard and Spencer Kensington were taken into federal custody without bail, their faces plastered across every major news outlet, completely stripped of their untouchable elite status. As for my family, they vanished into the background. The engagement was a public humiliation. The debts they had incurred to fund their social climbing collapsed in on them, leaving them to face the quiet, devastating reality of their own irrelevance. I blocked their numbers, severed all contact, and never looked back. Monday morning arrived with a bright, piercing clarity. I stood in my private chambers at the federal courthouse, surrounded by the towering shelves of legal volumes that had been my true sanctuary. The air smelled of polished wood and old paper. I reached out and took my black judicial robe from its wooden hanger. I slipped my arms into the heavy sleeves, feeling the familiar grounding weight of the fabric settle over my shoulders. I zipped it up the front, smoothing my hands over the dark material. This robe was not just a uniform. It was an armor forged from years of relentless dedication, unyielding integrity, and the quiet strength of a woman who had built her own empire out of the stones her family had thrown at her. The bailiff knocked softly on the door of my chambers. "We are ready for you, Your Honor." I took a deep breath, raised my chin, and walked out into the hallway. As I entered the massive oak-paneled courtroom, the entire gallery rose to their feet in absolute silence. I climbed the steps to the bench, taking my seat at the highest point in the room. I looked out over the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, and the scales of justice carved into the wall before me. I picked up my wooden gavel. I let it fall with a heavy, echoing strike. Court is now in session. The greatest lesson from my journey is that you never have to prove your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. For years, my family mistook my silence for weakness and my independence for failure. They worshipped the illusion of wealth and status, while I quietly built real power and integrity. Real success does not need to shout, and it certainly does not need validation from toxic people who only value you when they can use you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people underestimate you while you build your empire in the dark, because when the time is right, the truth will always speak for itself. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family to protect your peace and build your own success, let me know your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more.